The cry tore across the pines like a hawk's scream. "She's in the water! Look at her!" And boots thundered toward the lake's edge, the townsfolk spilling from the path in a rush of laughter and jeers, for nothing drew their cruelty quicker than weakness laid bare, and weakness is what they thought they saw in the woman floundering among the reeds, her pale shoulders gleaming in daylight, her heavy body trembling with the weight of shame, clutching at a sodden scrap of muslin that had once been her dress, but now clung uselessly to her chest, translucent and torn, exposing more than cloth could hide. She was no slim porcelain bride, but a woman of size and substance, curves the men mocked and the women spat at. "The mail-order sow," one cried. "No wonder her husband-to-be left her." Another hissed, and stones of laughter were hurled harder than the pebbles some boys pitched toward the water. And I, Elias Redfeather, your storyteller, tell you the cruelest storm that day wasn't wind nor water, but the sound of that mocking chorus. Her name was Clara May, though none cared to use it, and she had come west on the last wagon from St. Louis with a letter that promised marriage, a hearth, a family at last. But at the station her groom had never come, leaving only whispers that he'd seen her sighs and fled. And when she sought a place to stay, cruel hands had dragged her garments, stolen them as she bathed, leaving her stranded in the lake as sport for the crowd. She tried to sink herself deeper, the reeds cutting her skin as she whispered, "God, let me vanish." But the voices cut sharper. "Too big to vanish." "Even the water spits her back," they laughed, and just as despair gripped her throat, a shadow fell across the bank. A man tall, scarred, broad-shouldered, his hat low, his eyes hard with fury at what he saw. Daniel Holt, the lonely cowboy of 40 years who had buried a wife in his youth and touched no woman since, had come to the lake for water and found instead a trial. Without a word, he stripped his duster coat and strode waist-deep, the cold biting his flesh, until he reached her, his scarred hand gripping her arm, his coat wrapping around her trembling body with solemn finality. "Enough," he said, his voice cracking like a rifle report across the jeers. "She's clothed now, in my name." The crowd erupted, some gasping, others howling with scorn. "She's yours, that fat bride!" And her father's proxy, a smirking livery hand who had mocked her all week, sneered, "Then claim her proper, Holt, pay coin, or let us laugh her bare." The girl buried her face in his chest, the wet coat clinging to her curves, and Daniel looked out over the mob, jaw tight, eyes cold, and said words that would bind him forever. "She's my wife now, before God, before man, before this cursed lake." The water stilled as if listening, the crowd hushed in disbelief, and the vow once spoken hung heavy as thunderclouds. Would the town honor it, or would they demand he prove his claim with more than words? For a heartbeat the vow echoed louder than the jeers. The whole riverbank hushed beneath Daniel Holt's thundered claim, but silence never holds long where cruelty gathers, and soon the mob found its tongue again, louder, sharper, uglier. "His wife? She ain't fit for any man's table," cried one. "Look at her! Meat for hogs, not a wedding bed," shrieked another, their laughter breaking like stones against water, and Clara May clung tighter to Daniel's coat, her sobs muffled in the wool, while her bare legs shivered beneath the wet muslin still clinging like second skin. Daniel's hand never loosened, his scarred fingers pressing firm on her shoulder as if to pin her back into dignity. But the crowd pressed closer, their boots churning mud, their eyes hungry for spectacle, and Amos Pike, the merchant who thrived on every scandal, stepped forward with a smirk that stank of greed. "If you mean to take her, Holt, then prove it before us all. Coin or covenant, that's the rule," he barked, his cane jabbing at the ground. "A woman sold naked by the river can't be called wife by words alone." The mob cheered his cruelty, stamping their boots, some throwing reeds and stones at the water where moments ago she had floundered. And I, Elias Redfeather, who carries this tale, swear I saw the cruelty of men stripped bare in their faces that day. They did not want justice, only sport, only to see whether the lonely cowboy would bend like all the rest. Daniel's jaw worked, his chest heaving though his voice remained steady as steel. I'll not pay a penny for flesh, and I'll not hear her called less than a woman because of your filth. His words ringing clear, but Amos only grinned wider. Then let her father's hand decide, for he gave her papers to the broker, and I hold the contract myself. He lifted a folded sheet, smudged with ink and smears, waving it high for all to see. And Clara May whimpered, "No, I never signed. It was his bargain, not mine," her voice breaking like a twig underfoot, and yet the mob howled, "Paper binds stronger than vows. Show us Holt. Will you tear the law as easy as you claim her?" Daniel's eyes blazed, his hand reaching for the contract, but Amos pulled it back, taunting. "Not so fast. If you want her free, then prove yourself worthy, the way men have always proven on this river." He pointed toward the smooth, moss-covered stone at the bank's edge, half buried in silt, a stone so heavy no man had ever raised it to his waist, let alone his shoulders. "Lift it," Amos sneered. "And she's yours before God and town, but fail, and she comes with me, to be sold to the highest bidder." Gasps cut through the jeers, for all knew the stone, and Clara May gasped too, clutching his coat tighter, whispering, "Don't, please, they'll break you for their laughter." But Daniel placed a scarred hand against her wet cheek, his voice soft enough for her alone. "I've been broken 40 years already. This time I'll break for something worth the pain." And as he stepped toward the stone, the mob drew back in anticipation, eager to see whether vow or body would falter first. The whole riverbank trembling with the weight of the trial about to begin. The crowd pressed in, a living wall of sneers and hungry eyes, boots grinding reeds into the mud as they circled the trial Amos Pike had set, their breath steaming in the cool air, while the great river stone loomed at the bank's edge, slick with moss, its surface worn smooth by decades of current, a thing of permanence and weight that had humbled every fool who tried it before. "Lift it, Holt," Amos bellowed, waving the crumpled contract like a victory flag. "Raise it above your head, or walk away shamed, leaving her mine to sell." And the mob roared, stamping their boots as if the ground itself demanded the contest. Clara May shuddered beneath Daniel's duster coat, the wet fabric clinging to her soft frame, her voice breaking as she cried, "You don't need to prove anything to them. Please, they only want your ruin." But Daniel turned to her, his scarred hand brushing her cheek, his gaze steady despite the blood on his lip. "No, they want proof a vow means nothing, and I'll show them it means more than coin or paper." He stepped to the stone, crouching low, his boots sinking in mud as he set his scarred fingers to its edge, breath slow, shoulders knotting as he heaved, the veins in his arms standing like ropes as the stone groaned in its bed of earth. Lifting an inch, two, before slamming back with a thud that made the mob howl with laughter. "Too old! Too weak! The fat bride drags him down already," they jeered, and Clara May's sobs cut sharp as knives, but Daniel only spat in the dirt, squared his stance, and bent again. "I, Elias Redfeather, who tells you this tale, swear I saw more than flesh straining that day. I saw 40 winters of silence, of empty nights, of prayers unanswered, all driving into his bones as he heaved once more." The stone rose, higher this time, mud sliding down its sides, his teeth gritted, his back bent like a drawn bow. The crowd's laughter faltering into gasps as it reached his chest. His face was red with the strain, breath tearing through him like a storm, his body trembling on the edge of collapse. But when his eyes caught Clara's, wide with fear, yet glowing with something fierce, belief, he roared, thrusting upward, forcing the stone above his head. For 3 long heartbeats he held it there, a mountain raised by will alone, and the mob fell into stunned silence, Amos's mouth gaping as the contract sagged in his hand. Then with a cry, Daniel let it drop, the crash shaking the ground, water splashing high, the stone settling deeper than before, as if earth itself had accepted the vow. "You saw it!" Daniel roared, chest heaving, blood and sweat mingling on his face. "She's mine, not by paper, not by coin, but by vow and by strength, and none here can deny it." The hush that followed was broken only by Clara's sob, this time not of shame but of awe. Yet her father's proxy Amos snarled, shoving forward, "Strength don't make a wife, coin does, and until I'm paid the girl ain't his." And the mob, restless and divided, stirred again, torn between the miracle they had seen and the greed that still whispered from Amos's lips. The paper crackled louder than the river itself as Amos Pike waved it high, his voice a whip cutting through the stunned silence. "This here contract is binding, signed and sealed in Denver, and no show of sweat or stone can break it." His words lit the mob anew, their hunger for spectacle twisting into mutters of law and coin, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disbelief after what they had witnessed. Clara May clutched Daniel's coat tighter around her body, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks, her voice shaking but clear enough to reach him. "Please don't fight them with your fists. They'll only drag you down to their level." But Daniel's eyes stayed on Amos, the crumpled paper flapping in the wind like a vulture's wing. "That scrap don't bind her soul," he growled, voice gravel deep. "It don't bind mine either. If she says no, then it's nothing." Amos sneered, his lip curling over tobacco-stained teeth. "She can't say no. Her pa signed her name when he sold her, and the mountain don't care for talk of souls." The mob jeered, some laughing, others restless, the taste of violence sharp in the cold air. Then Clara May, trembling but fierce, stepped forward, bare feet sinking into the mud, her eyes blazing despite the tears. "You speak of my father's mark," she shouted, voice cracking the hush like lightning. "But my hand never touched that paper, and no man owns me but the Lord above." Gasps rippled through the crowd, shock painted on rough frontier faces unused to hearing a woman's defiance. Amos snarled, lunging toward her with a hand raised to strike, but Daniel was faster, his fist crashing into Amos's jaw with the sound of bone and thunder, sending him sprawling into the reeds. The paper flew from his grip, fluttering in the wind before landing on the river's edge. Daniel strode over, picked it up, and without ceremony ripped it clean in 2, the pieces scattering like dead leaves into the current. "There," he roared, chest heaving. "The mountain's law is stronger than Denver's ink, and the river's carried off your lies." The mob erupted, some cheering, some shouting in outrage, but the tide had turned. Men who had mocked Clara only moments before looked away, ashamed, while a few women in the back pressed hands to their mouths, their eyes wet with something like respect. Amos staggered to his feet, blood running down his chin, his pride shredded with the paper. "This ain't over," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at Daniel. "The law will hear of this. They'll take her from you by force if they must." Daniel met his threat with cold fire in his eyes. "Then let them come. I'll face them same as I faced your stone. I, Elias Redfeather, swear to you who listen that it was in that moment the mountain itself seemed to side with them. The wind dropped, the river's rush softened, and for the first time since her shame began, Clara May stood taller, no longer a woman stripped bare, but a bride claimed in defiance. Yet beneath her relief flickered fear, for Amos's words carried weight, and the law he spoke of had long arms that stretched farther than stone or vow. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispers curling through the pines, and as Daniel led Clara back toward the cabin, her fingers gripping his scarred hand as if it were her anchor. One truth settled heavy in both their hearts. They had won the riverbank, but the greater battle was only just begun. Night pressed heavy over the cabin, the fire snapping inside as Daniel stoked it with one hand and pressed a damp cloth to the swelling on his jaw with the other. Clara May sat across from him, wrapped in a wool blanket he had fetched from the chest, her face pale but her eyes restless, haunted by shadows older than this day. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind pressing against the shutters, until she spoke at last, her voice trembling like the flame. "You think my shame was born at the river," she whispered, "but it began long before." Daniel lowered the cloth, watching her closely, his voice low. "Tell me." She swallowed hard, gripping the blanket until her knuckles showed white. "I was meant for Amos, not for you," she confessed, the words tasting of ash. "My father sold me cheap to clear a debt, and Amos swore he'd parade me before the town to prove he'd bought something no one else would touch. He's the one who ordered the girls to take my dress, to throw me into that lake and call it God's judgment." Her voice cracked into sobs, but her eyes burned with humiliation and rage. "He wanted me broken before I even reached your door, Daniel. He wanted me crawling so low that no man would raise me again." Daniel's jaw tightened, his scar pulling at the corner of his mouth as he fought the fury rising in him. He stood and crossed the room, kneeling before her, his scarred hands covering hers with a gentleness that surprised them both. "Then hear me plain," he said, steady as stone. "He failed. He stripped you bare before the town, but he couldn't strip your courage. You walked out of that water and faced them. That's what I'll remember. That's what they'll come to remember too. I, Elias Redfeather, who carries this tale through the years, tell you that in that small cabin, with only the fire for witness, a vow greater than any paper was sealed, not in ink, not in coin, but in the meeting of two broken lives that found strength together." Clara's tears spilled freely now, but they were not the same tears she had shed at the river. These were tears of release, of a weight finally spoken aloud. "Do you believe," she asked softly, "that a woman like me could be more than a debt paid, more than a burden passed?" Daniel brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek, his eyes fierce. "I believe a woman like you could be a man's forever, and Amos Pike will choke on the truth of it before I'm done." But even as he spoke, hoofbeats cracked the silence outside, echoing through the frozen night. Clara stiffened, clutching the blanket. Daniel rose, hand reaching for the rifle above the door, his heart thundering like the hooves outside. Voices carried up the slope, rough, eager, carrying the threat of men who served Amos's pride. The storm at the river had only been the beginning. The hoofbeats drew closer, their rhythm like a war drum against the frozen earth, and Clara clutched the blanket tighter around her chest, her wide eyes fixed on the door as shadows flickered across the window, the sound of rough laughter and jangling spurs cutting through the night. Daniel stood tall before the fire, his rifle cradled in scarred hands, his jaw set like granite, for he had seen this moment coming ever since he tore Amos's contract and shamed him before the town. And he knew a man like Pike would not rest until vengeance was paid in blood. The door rattled with the first heavy fist, a voice slurring through the wood. "Come out, Holt! Bring us the fat sow, or we'll burn your shack with her inside!" Clara whimpered, pressing herself deeper into the chair, tears streaming as she whispered, "They'll drag me through the mud again, Daniel. They'll make me naked for the whole town," her shame slicing through the dark more viciously than the men outside. Daniel turned, his shadow long and fierce against the wall, and knelt beside her, his scarred hand cupping her face. "Not while I draw breath. You've been traded, mocked, stripped, but tonight you'll be kept. Do you trust me?" She nodded through her tears. Clutching his wrist as though it were the last anchor left in the storm, He rose, throwing open the door with the rifle raised, the cold night rushing in, and the men outside reeled back, torches sputtering in their hands as Daniel's voice cut the dark like thunder. "You'll not have her," he roared. "She's under my roof, and that makes her mine by vow, by stone, and by God himself." The riders sneered, a pack of wolves circling, their leader a scar-faced brute who spat into the snow and snarled, "Then you'll die for her, Holt. Ain't no man trades his life for a sow." The others jeered, swinging down from their saddles, clubs and knives glinting in torchlight. But Daniel did not flinch, his rifle leveled steady, the barrel catching firelight, his finger steady as stone. I, Elias Redfeather, who watched the frontier turn with such nights, tell you this moment was heavier than the stone Holt had lifted. For strength alone would not save him now, only the courage to stand unbroken when all the world pressed for him to bend. Clara, behind him, rose trembling from the chair, her blanket slipping from one shoulder as she stood tall for the first time since the river, her voice cutting through the night with desperate courage. "He's my husband. If you mean to drag me, you'll drag us both." The men faltered, their torches wavering as shame rippled even among wolves, but the scar-faced leader only laughed. "Then let's take them together." And with a snarl he charged, the others rushing after, and the cabin erupted into the clash that would decide whether vow or greed ruled the night. The door buckled beneath the weight of boots and shoulders slamming into it, splinters flying as Daniel braced it with his back, rifle still clutched in his hands, the firelight flickering across his scarred jaw as shadows writhed against the walls, the voices outside howling like wolves drunk on bloodlust. Clara pressed herself against the far wall, clutching the slipping blanket to her chest. But when the frame groaned and the latch snapped, she cried out, "Daniel!" And he answered with a roar, shoving forward just as the door burst wide, sending two men sprawling across the threshold. The scar-faced leader lunged in behind them, blade gleaming in the firelight, his eyes filled with Amos's poison, and Daniel fired, the crack splitting the cabin air, smoke curling as one of the riders fell hard into the embers, screaming. The others surged, swinging clubs and knives, the fight spilling into the cramped room, the table shattering under the weight of bodies, chairs splintering as fists and steel clashed in chaos. Daniel swung the rifle stock like an axe, cracking one man across the skull, blood spraying against the walls, but another rushed low, blade catching him in the side, and he grunted in pain, staggering back, his teeth clenched against the hot sting. Clara's scream filled the cabin, and I, Elias Redfeather, who carries this tale, tell you it was no longer the cry of shame but of fury, a sound born of a woman who had been mocked, stripped, broken, and refused to be again. She seized the iron poker from the fire, swinging it with both hands into the ribs of the nearest attacker, the hiss of flesh against hot iron filling the cabin as he shrieked and stumbled back into the dark. Daniel's eyes caught hers through the smoke, fierce pride blazing as he bellowed, "Stay behind me!" And with a surge of strength, he drove another rider out through the doorway with a kick that rattled the frame. But the scar-faced leader pressed in, blade dripping, sneering through broken teeth. "You can't keep her, Holt. Not from Amos, not from me. She'll be dragged back where she belongs." His knife arced for Clara, but Daniel stepped into its path, the steel grazing his arm as he caught the man's wrist, their bodies locked in a deadly grapple, muscles straining, boots grinding in ash and blood. Clara cried his name again, tears streaming, the poker trembling in her hands as she searched for a moment to strike, the blanket slipping from her shoulders to pool at her feet, her body bare but her spirit burning brighter than the flames. The fight raged, smoke stinging their eyes, and outside more hoofbeats thundered closer, fresh riders drawn by the blaze, the siege growing heavier with every passing breath. Daniel's voice was hoarse as he strained against the scar-faced brute. Stay strong, Clara. We hold this night, or lose it forever. And his words hung heavy as a vow, the outcome teetering on the knife's edge, the cabin trembling with the storm of men and fire. The cabin walls shuddered with every blow, fists and boots battering the frame, smoke stinging the air as the fire spat sparks across the floorboards, and Daniel's strength began to waver, his grip on the scar-faced brute's knife hand trembling as blood poured from his side, his face pale with pain, yet his eyes still locked on Clara with the iron promise of a man who would die before he let her fall. The rider snarled through broken teeth, pressing harder, the blade inching closer to Daniel's throat, the mob outside baying like hounds as the siege pressed louder, and Clara's heart hammered until it seemed to shake her very bones. She stared at Daniel's blood, at the man who had called her wife when no one else would call her human, and something inside her snapped. Not into fear, but into fire. She seized the iron poker again, the heat burning her palms raw, and stepped forward, the blanket falling fully to the floor, leaving her body bare before the fire and the fight. Yet she no longer flinched at the sight of her own flesh. "No more," she screamed, her voice cutting sharper than the blade, and with a wild swing she brought the poker crashing down across the brute's back. He howled, collapsing to his knees, the knife clattering free. And Daniel drove his fist into his jaw with a crack like breaking stone, sending him sprawling across the shattered table. The mob outside faltered at the sudden silence, their jeers cut short by the woman's cry that had carried through the smoke and dark, a cry that was no longer shame but defiance. Daniel staggered, catching the wall for balance, his chest heaving, eyes wide as he stared at Clara, who now stood tall in the firelight, her body scarred by cruelty but unbowed, the poker raised like a banner. "You wanted me naked!" she shouted toward the door, her voice ringing across the night. "Then look, and know this, I am no man's joke, no man's property, and I will not crawl again. I am his wife, by vow, by stone, and by choice, and I'll strike down any who call me less." A hush rippled through the riders outside, their torches wavering as her words cut deeper than any steel. I, Elias Redfeather, who bore witness in the telling, swear the mob's hunger faltered then, for no spectacle tastes sweet once the victim refuses to play the role. Still, the scar-faced brute staggered up again, blood pouring down his brow, his hatred boiling as he spat. "You'll never be a wife, only a sow who ruined a man's name." And he lunged once more, knife raised high. But Clara was faster this time, her arms steady, her strike sure, the poker cracked against his temple, dropping him lifeless to the floor. The silence that followed stretched long, broken only by the hiss of fire and Daniel's ragged breath. Then, as if some unseen weight had shifted, the riders outside began to retreat, their hoofbeats fading into the night one by one, leaving only smoke, blood, and the two within the battered cabin. Daniel's voice was hoarse as he reached for her hand, his eyes burning with awe. "Clara, you saved me." And for the first time in her life, she believed the words, standing not as a burden, but as the woman who had turned shame into fire and claimed her place at his side. Dawn broke with the cruel honesty only the mountains could offer, cold and blinding, the smoke from the ruined cabin curling into the pale sky as Clara and Daniel stood amidst the wreckage, her body wrapped once more in the blanket, though she no longer trembled beneath it, and his arm heavy across her shoulders, though he bled still from the night's wound. The scar-faced brute lay dead on the floor, his hate extinguished by her hand, and the knowledge of what she had done hung thick in the silence. Yet before they could even rest, the sound of hoofbeats thundered again, and Clara's stomach knotted, fearing the mob's return, until she saw that this time it was not riders with torches, but townsfolk with wide eyes and cautious voices. The word had spread before sunrise, whispers running faster than fire. that the obese mail-order bride had stood bare against a mob, struck down her tormentor, and declared herself wife in the mountain man's house. The sheriff himself rode at the front, his face dark with doubt, his hand resting near his revolver, as if the truth of such a tale required steel to settle. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on frost, his gaze flicking from the bloodstains on Daniel's shirt to the lifeless body sprawled across the floorboards. And finally to Clara, whose chin lifted though her throat felt raw. "Is it true?" the sheriff asked, his voice low, for half the town now crowded the clearing, men and women who had mocked her on the riverbank, who had called her names in the dark, who now watched with uneasy awe. "Did you kill him, girl?" Clara's fingers tightened around the iron poker still in her grasp, blackened now with soot and blood, and she spoke so all could hear. "I defended my husband, as any wife would." The words struck the crowd like a stone hurled into still water, ripples of surprise and shame spreading through the faces that once had laughed at her misery. Daniel staggered forward, his voice rough but clear. "She saved my life. She saved herself, and she's my wife by vow and by God's eyes. That's the end of it." A murmur rose among the townsfolk, some muttering that she had no right, others nodding as though the mountain itself had spoken through him. The sheriff's jaw tightened, the law in him wrestling with the crowd's hunger for spectacle and the undeniable truth of the scene before him. Finally he tipped his hat, his voice grim. "What's done is done. The man was outlaw, long past saving. If she stood her ground, then justice is served." With that, he turned his horse and rode off, leaving the crowd to reckon with their own shame. No jeers came now, no laughter, only silence broken by the shuffle of boots as they began to drift away, each one carrying the image of the woman who had stood naked and unbroken before them. I, Elias Redfeather, your teller of this tale, must pause here to say, the frontier could be crueler than any whip, but it was also a place where a single act could remake a soul's place forever. As the last rider disappeared down the slope, Daniel turned to Clara, his eyes still glassy with pain, yet lit with something more enduring. "They'll talk of this day for years," he whispered. Clara held the poker tighter, her voice steady. "Then let them talk. They'll speak of a wife, not a spectacle." And in the hard morning light, with smoke still rising from their battered home, it felt as though the judgment of the world had shifted, not in whispers of shame, but in the weight of respect she had wrested from it with her own 2 hands. The snow melted slow that spring, dripping from the eaves of the rebuilt cabin, as if the mountain itself wished to wash away the memory of fire and blood. And Clara stood in the doorway, heavier now with child, the blanket draped across her shoulders like a mantle of earned dignity. Daniel worked in the yard, driving the final post into a new fence, his movements deliberate though the scar on his side pulled at him still, but his gaze rose to her often, as if to remind himself she was real, that she had chosen to remain. The town had grown quiet in the months since that night. No more jeers carried on the wind. No more cruel laughter from the valley, only hushed talk of the woman who had met her, shame with steel, and claimed her place beside a mountain man. When the preacher came up the trail one pale morning, carrying only his worn Bible and the dust of many miles, Daniel met him at the gate, his voice low. "We'd like the vows spoken proper. She deserves that." And so, beneath a sky cut sharp with blue, with pines whispering like a choir, the preacher read words that bound 2 souls, not by paper or bargain, but by choice and endurance. Clara's hand trembled as she took Daniel's, not from fear, but from the weight of a promise she had never imagined would be hers. That she, mocked and stripped and cast away, would be called wife without question, partner without shame, Daniel's voice broke as he said, "With all I am, I take you." For he had spent 40 years untouched by closeness, believing the mountain his only companion, until a naked, broken bride had risen from water and claimed him with nothing but defiance. When the vows ended, the preacher pressed their hands together and stepped back, his eyes damp with something softer than duty. "God gives different gifts to different people," he said. "Yours is resilience. Build on it." Clara lifted her chin, her eyes glistening. "We've already begun." That night, as firelight filled the cabin, Daniel placed the old blanket, the same that had hidden her shame on the riverbank, across their bed, not as a cover but as a relic of what had been endured. Clara ran her hands across its worn fibers, her voice quiet. "This held me when I had nothing. Now it will hold us both." Daniel kissed her forehead, and for the first time since the mountains had claimed him, he whispered the word love. Not as fantasy, but as something carved from hardship, a thing that had survived the judgment of men and the cruelty of storms. I, Elias Redfeather, who have carried many tales across the frontier, tell you this. It wasn't beauty that bound them, nor pity, nor fleeting desire, but the steady courage of a woman who would not flee and a man who dared to believe in her strength. And so it was, in the year 1876, that the obese mail-order bride, once mocked and left naked by the river, became forever the mountain man's wife, her blanket their altar, their cabin their church, their love a vow no storm could undo. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If you had stood by the river that day, would you have turned away or stepped forward to claim her dignity too?